In 1972, a scientist named John Calhoun sealed a group of mice inside a metal box. The box had everything: unlimited food, unlimited water, no predators, no disease. Temperature controlled. Every physical need covered, permanently, with no effort required. It should have been paradise. Instead, within a few years, the colony collapsed completely. Not from starvation, not from disease. The mice stopped reproducing. Stopped socializing. A whole generation simply withdrew from the group, grooming themselves obsessively, moving through the space like ghosts, perfectly healthy and completely disengaged. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones. He spent the rest of his life trying to figure out what they were telling him. 50 years later, Gallup surveyed workers across 160 countries. They found that only 21% of the global workforce is what they call engaged, meaning they actually care about the work they're doing. The other 79% are either going through the motions or actively working against their organization. 79%. And that number has barely moved in a decade. Different countries, different economies, different languages, same withdrawal, same timing, same shape. That's not a trend, that's a signal. And the signal points straight back to Calhoun's box. Picture someone you know, or maybe yourself, sitting at a desk, finishing a task they're good at, sending the completed file, and feeling nothing. Not tired, not proud, not frustrated, just nothing. The effort went in, the work came out, and somewhere between the two, the feedback loop broke. That sensation has a name now. Several of them, depending on which country you're in. In China, it's tang, lying flat. In South Korea, emotional resignation from a system that feels unwinnable. In the United States, quiet quitting. In online spaces everywhere, goblin mode. The deliberate abandonment of productivity as identity. These didn't spread from a single source. They emerged independently in countries with almost nothing in common economically. One running a brutal 96-hour workweek culture. Another obsessed with hustle as a moral virtue. A third with youth unemployment so severe the government stopped publishing the statistics. Same output. Different inputs. That is the signature of something biological, not cultural. The scale confirms it. Over 50 million Americans quit their jobs in a single year during what economists named the Great Resignation. Not because conditions suddenly got worse. In many cases, conditions had technically improved. Remote work, more flexibility, better pay in some sectors. People left anyway. And the ones who stayed? A 2025 report estimated that disengagement costs the global economy approximately $8.9 trillion per year in lost productivity. That is roughly the size of the Japanese and German economies combined. Evaporating every year, not from war or disaster, but from people sitting at desks and not caring. The standard explanations don't hold. Burnout is exhaustion from overload. But the beautiful ones in Calhoun's box weren't overloaded. They were understimulated. Laziness? 47% of Gen Z report they are coasting. But the same generation logs more voluntary hours of self-directed learning than any previous cohort. They're not avoiding effort. They are avoiding this particular effort in this particular structure. Bad management? Possibly. But bad management doesn't explain why the same pattern appeared across systems with fundamentally different structures, different cultures, and different relationships to work and collective obligation. Something else is happening. Something that apparently doesn't care which country you live in, what economy you were born into, or what species you are. To find it, you have to go back to a question Calhoun never stopped asking. What exactly did the beautiful ones run out of? Calhoun's experiment was called Universe 25. The name reflected his belief that it was a model, not just of mice, but of what happens to any social species when a specific condition is removed. The condition wasn't food, it wasn't space, it wasn't safety. It was legible contribution. Here is what the experiment actually showed, and why it matters for a brain that evolved 60,000 years before John Calhoun was born. Picture a hunting group on the African savanna. Around 30 people. This number is not arbitrary. The human brain, across every population ever studied, naturally organizes social structure around groups of this size. Not because anyone decided it, because the neocortex, the part of the brain that tracks relationships and reads faces and remembers who owes who a favor, has a processing ceiling. It can actively maintain somewhere between 25 and 50 stable social connections before the architecture starts to strain. In that group of 30 people, every single person holds a position that the others can see. There is a person who reads terrain, who knows which ridge hides a water source and which doesn't. There is a person who tracks wounded animals across 2 days of mixed ground without losing the thread. There is a person the group turns to when something goes wrong after dark. not because they were elected, but because the group learned through repeated evidence that this particular brain stays calm under pressure. These are not job titles. They are visible contributions to a group small enough to register every single one. And this is the mechanism that neuroscience spent decades mapping. The brain does not run on abstract purpose. It runs on a specific feedback loop. Effort produces a visible outcome, the group registers that outcome, and a cluster of neurons in the brainstem, the dorsal raphe nucleus, releases serotonin. Not as a reward for feeling good, as a signal that you have a place in the structure, that the group knows you are there, that you are load-bearing. Serotonin in this context is not a happiness chemical. It is a rank confirmation signal. It tells the brain, you contributed, you were seen, it is safe to keep going. When that signal fires consistently, behavior organizes around it. The tracker keeps tracking. The terrain reader keeps reading terrain. The calm under pressure person steps forward again, because every time they did, the loop confirmed it was worth doing. Now take that system and place it inside an enclosure where effort has become invisible. The colony in Universe 25 didn't collapse because the mice gave up. It collapsed because the structure filled up faster than roles could be created. There were mice who wanted to contribute, to defend, to track, to build. There simply wasn't anything left to contribute to. The group had grown beyond the size where individual effort could return a legible signal. Outcomes were invisible. The feedback loop had nowhere to land. The dorsal raphe nucleus read the environment correctly. Effort to signal ratio collapsed. Stand down. For 50 years after Universe 25, the accepted reading was this. The beautiful ones had been taught by their environment to stop trying. Passivity was something installed by repeated failure. The brain starts motivated and loses it. Withdrawal is learned. That was the theory. Then, in 2016, a neuroscientist named Stephen Maier, who had spent his career working alongside Martin Seligman on the original learned helplessness experiments, published a paper that turned the model upside down. The old theory said the brain begins in a state of motivation and learns helplessness. Maier's data said the opposite. Passivity is not learned. It is the default. The brain does not start motivated and lose it. It starts in a state of conserve and withdraw, the dorsal raphe nucleus running a shutdown protocol continuously. And it learns, through repeated evidence of controllable outcomes, to override that default and engage. Agency is not the starting point. Agency is the achievement. This changes everything about how you read the beautiful ones. They weren't animals who had given up. They were animals who had never accumulated enough successful effort to signal cycles to build the override in the first place. They grew up inside a structure where the feedback loop never ran. Not because they were broken, because the environment never gave them the raw material to build agency from. Move them to a clean enclosure, which Calhoun did, and the problem doesn't disappear. The enclosure changed. The brains didn't, because the brains weren't waiting for a better environment. They were waiting for evidence. Accumulated, repeated, visible evidence that effort produces an outcome that a group small enough to notice will actually notice. A clean cage with no such evidence is still a cage. Now look at a modern office. Open-plan floors where no one can tell who did what. Metrics that track activity rather than contribution. Organizations of thousands where the link between individual effort and visible group outcome has been engineered out of the system entirely. Inboxes that generate effort with no visible endpoint. Meetings that produce no legible result. The dorsal raphe nucleus reads this environment the same way it read Universe 25. Effort to signal ratio collapsed. Stand down. Not a choice, not a character flaw, not a generational failure of ambition or resilience. A 50,000-year-old system running exactly as designed, inside a world it was never designed for. The beautiful ones didn't opt out of society. They ran the default that every mammalian brain runs when the signal goes dark. So is the 79%. So if the brain isn't broken, if this is a calibration problem, not a character problem, the question becomes, what does the calibration actually require? Not purpose, not meaning, not a better mindset. Evidence. Specifically, repeated, visible evidence that effort produces outcomes in a group small enough to notice. That is the entire input the dorsal raphe nucleus is waiting for. Not inspiration, not a promotion, not a mission statement on a wall. A legible signal returned consistently from a group whose size allows the signal to land. Here's where it gets specific. There is a religious community called the Hutterites. They have been living in communal settlements across North America since the 16th century. largely isolated from the economic systems that produced quiet quitting and tang and the Great Resignation. They have one rule about community size that they have followed, without exception, for over 400 years. When a settlement exceeds 150 people, they split. Not because of conflict, not because resources run out, because somewhere above that number they observed, empirically across centuries, that the community stops functioning the way a community should. Contribution becomes less visible. People disengage. The signal gets harder to return, so they divide deliberately before the threshold is crossed and start again at a size where every person's effort is legible to every other person. They did not read Robin Dunbar. They did not read John Calhoun. They had never heard of the dorsal raphe nucleus. They just noticed, 400 years before the neuroscience caught up, that the brain has a ceiling, and that building above it produces a specific kind of silence. The same silence Gallup measured across 160 countries. The same silence that got named quiet quitting and tang and goblin mode, as if naming it differently in each language might reveal a different cause. It doesn't. The group got too large for the signal to return. The brain defaulted. The Hutterites split the community and started the signal again. That's the whole mechanism. 400 years old, hiding in plain sight, 150 people at a time. Now, here's the part that gets stranger. If a group of 150 is the ceiling where the signal still works, what happens when you put 150 people inside a city of 10 million? That has an answer, and it involves a pattern that cities have been producing for 200 years without anyone quite understanding why. If this is how you want to see the world, subscribe. There's more.